The room was silent in a way that seasoned journalists instantly recognize an uneasy silence, the kind that sits on everyone's shoulders before something unpredictable happens. At the center of the G20 conference hall in South Africa, under the bright white lights and the circle of flags, one chair stood out more than all the others. It was marked United States. It had been empty for days. And for the watching world, especially for those of us old enough to remember when America's seat was the first to be filled, that empty chair said more than any press release ever could. Just hours before the summit, a ripple moved through the press pool. South Africa's state media was reporting that the Trump administration might be reversing course and considering a last-minute appearance in one shape, form, or other. No one knew what that meant. Not the journalists, not the diplomats, not even, as it would soon become clear, the South African president himself. The questions came fast. Was America returning to the G20? If so, in what capacity? And perhaps the most unsettling question for many, could the United States still be considered a predictable, reliable partner? For older viewers, people who lived through the Cold War, the rise of global institutions, and decades when American leadership was the steady anchor of international gatherings, this sudden uncertainty felt strange, even uncomfortable. What had changed? How did the world reach a point where allies were openly asking whether the European Union was now more dependable than the United States? As journalists leaned forward waiting for answers, the emotional weight in the room was unmistakable. This wasn't just a scheduling issue. It was a moment that revealed the shifting balance of global trust. Before we go deeper into what happened next and why the response from the Trump administration became one of the sharpest diplomatic exchanges of the summit, I invite you to stay with this story. If you believe global leadership must be earned through consistency, not last-minute decisions, please keep watching. And if you want more clarity behind the headlines, consider sharing and subscribing. In the minutes after the silence settled, the first journalist finally stood. His voice carried the unease that everyone else felt but hadn't yet spoken aloud. He cited South Africa's own state media reports that the Trump administration now did want to participate in the G20 after all. And then, without softening the blow, he asked the question that landed like a stone in water. Can you confirm whether they're true or not? It was a simple question, but loaded with diplomatic weight. Everyone in the room understood that. The journalist wasn't only asking if America would show up, he was asking whether the world's most powerful nation still understood the importance of committing to global cooperation and whether South Africa, now hosting the G20, could trust America's word. The South African president responded carefully. He explained that yes, a notice had been received from the United States. Not a firm confirmation, not a formal delegation plan, just a notice. And that notice, he emphasized, came at an extremely late hour when logistics for world leaders had already been locked in. He described it as a change of mind about participating in one shape, form, or other. It was a phrase that raised more questions than it answered, because no one, not even the host nation, could explain what the United States intended. Still, he chose a diplomatic tone. He called the shift a positive sign. He reminded the room that boycott politics never work and insisted it was better for every nation to be inside the tent than outside of it. The tent, as he put it, was the G20, a space meant for every major economy to speak openly, even when they disagreed. For older viewers who remember decades when American leadership shaped the tone of these gatherings, his words carried a subtle message: the G20 is now learning to function without the predictability it once relied on. He was also clear about another point: the United States is a founding member of the G20 and therefore has every right to be present. Whether they arrived late or early, whether they sent a president or a representative, whether they had withdrawn days ago or reappeared unexpectedly, America's seat was still part of the circle. He even pointed out that the physical chair for the U.S. remained exactly where it had always been, empty for a while, but hopefully soon occupied. But that didn't resolve the problem. The president explained that the difficulty wasn't political, it was practical. G20 gatherings require enormous coordination: motorcades, security clearances, speaking orders, bilateral meetings, translation schedules, seating arrangements. All of those had been planned without the United States because America had said it would not attend. Now everything had to be reconsidered at the last possible moment. The journalists pressed further. One of them asked whether, because of these late changes, it might actually be impractical to accommodate the United States at all. The president refused to go in that direction. He repeated calmly that America as a member had the right to participate and would be welcomed, but his expression hinted at the reality late decisions carry costs, even for a superpower. Then came the question from Peter Fabricius, a veteran reporter known for knowing more than most diplomats prefer. He asked whether the U.S. had initially requested only that the chargé d'affaires in Pretoria participate in a ceremonial handover and whether this new communication from Washington implied a deeper level of involvement. The president, almost with a half-smile, acknowledged that another message had arrived while he was sitting in the bilateral meeting. "We are still digesting that one," he said. It was an honest admission the host nation was reacting in real time to an unpredictable partner. As the murmurs spread across the room, another journalist cited the New York Times reporting that the U.S. would be sending an official named Mark Dillard. With every question, the picture became less clear, not more. Was America coming back into the tent, or merely stepping close enough to avoid criticism? The world didn't yet know, and neither did South Africa. This moment, the confusion, the contradictions, the hesitation set the stage for the explosive reaction that would come next. As the questions grew more pointed, the atmosphere in the room thickened. Everyone sensed that something bigger than a scheduling issue was unfolding. Every journalist there, even the ones who had covered summits for decades, could feel the story shifting. It was no longer simply about whether America would attend. It was about how the United States, the world's largest economy and once the most stable diplomatic actor at these gatherings, was choosing to communicate with the rest of the world. Peter Fabricius, known for his sharp instincts and quiet confidence, leaned into his microphone. He asked whether the United States had originally planned only for the chargé d'affaires in Pretoria to participate in the handover ceremony, nothing more. He was careful, respectful, but there was a hint of challenge in his tone. He was essentially asking whether Washington had changed its mind yet again. The South African president paused, looked up, and admitted that another communication from the United States had arrived while he was sitting in the meeting. "We are still digesting that one," he said. It was an unexpectedly human moment, one that revealed how unprepared the host nation was for America's sudden shifts. Leaders of G20 nations rarely admit confusion publicly, yet here was the president of South Africa saying openly that he himself didn't yet understand what the United States intended. That honesty made the room feel even more tense. If the host didn't know what was happening, who did? Then came the next blow. A journalist stood and cited the New York Times reporting that the U.S. would be sending an official Mark Dillard to the summit. That created a visible ripple of interest across the room. A name meant something. A named official sounded more serious than a vague shape, form, or other, but it also deepened the mystery. Was this the representative for the ceremonial handover, or someone sent to participate in discussions no one knew? And that's precisely when everything changed. A representative from the Trump administration, stern-voiced, steady, unmistakably irritated, spoke on record. What he said didn't just shift the story, it detonated the calm diplomatic tone that had filled the hall moments before. "I saw the South African president running his mouth a little bit," he said. The words struck the room like a cold wind, a collective inhale, eyebrows raised. A few people looked up from their notebooks as if unsure whether they heard correctly. Diplomats simply do not speak like that about heads of state, certainly not in public, and absolutely not at a G20 summit. The American representative continued sharper this time, and that language is not appreciated by the president or his team. The tone was dismissive, almost scolding. For many older viewers, people who remember the era of formal diplomatic etiquette, crafted statements, and carefully measured language, these words would feel jarring, even disrespectful. The contrast was stark. Moments earlier, the South African president spoke softly, diplomatically emphasizing cooperation. Now, the United States was responding with something far closer to confrontation. Then came the most direct accusation of all. He stated that the South African president was falsely claiming that the United States aimed to participate in official G20 talks. According to him, there was no such intention. He insisted that the U.S. representative was present only to acknowledge the ceremonial handover because the United States would host the next G20. That declaration, delivered with absolute certainty, erased what little clarity existed. If South Africa had understood the message one way and Washington was now publicly contradicting it, then someone was accused of misrepresenting the truth on an international stage. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a diplomatic rebuke. As the American representative finished speaking, the room felt different. The tension was no longer quiet. It was sharp, exposed, undeniable. South Africa appeared caught off guard. Journalists began scribbling quickly. And for the first time since the summit began, it became clear that this was not a simple miscommunication. It was a clash, one that revealed how fragile trust between nations had become and how quickly a single statement could shift the balance of the entire summit. When the sharp words from the American representative stopped echoing through the room, the silence that followed was different from the earlier unease. This time it felt wounded. Journalists exchanged glances, diplomats shifted in their chairs, and even the South African officials standing along the wall seemed momentarily unsure of how to respond. It is one thing for international partners to disagree. It is something else entirely when one government publicly accuses another of running his mouth at a gathering built on mutual respect. For South Africans watching from home, many of whom had hoped their country's role as G20 host would symbolize rising continental confidence, this moment carried a sting. Hosting the summit was supposed to show that South Africa could manage global leadership with dignity, but now their president was being spoken to in a tone usually reserved for domestic political opponents, not heads of state. The emotional impact on the public was subtle but real, a mixture of embarrassment, frustration, and concern about how their nation was being perceived. Politically, the exchange exposed a fault line that had been simmering for months: the question of whether the United States under Trump's leadership still valued multilateral cooperation. World leaders had grown used to last-minute shifts, sudden withdrawals, and sudden re-entries. Yet seeing those dynamics play out live on camera during a G20 summit in Africa intensified the sense of unpredictability. For nations depending on stable global partnerships, especially developing countries, uncertainty is never a neutral factor. It affects investment, trade expectations, and diplomatic planning. The logistical consequences were equally disruptive. Summits like the G20 operate on tight choreography motorcades mapped to the minute, bilateral meetings arranged months in advance, security protocols layered like clockwork. But America's initial withdrawal had already required adjustments. Now the possibility of a last-minute reappearance followed by the U.S., insisting they would not participate in official talks, left organizers scrambling. Should speaking orders be rewritten? Should security teams prepare for possible arrival or not? No one knew. Inside South Africa's political circles, the disagreement also raised uncomfortable questions. If the president had genuinely misunderstood the U.S. intentions, it meant communication channels had broken down at some point. But if Washington was misrepresenting its own earlier message, then South Africa had been pushed into a position where they appeared misleading without intending to. In diplomacy, perception alone can wound credibility. For everyday citizens beyond South Africa, especially across Africa, the moment fed into a broader conversation: how should rising nations navigate partnerships with global powers that no longer always speak with one voice or act with predictability? Some observers quietly noted that this kind of public clash rarely happened when African nations dealt with blocs like the EU, whose style tends to be formal, measured, and predictable. Whether fair or not, comparisons were being drawn. Internationally, these cracks didn't go unnoticed. Journalists abroad began framing the incident as evidence of shifting global trust. That empty U.S. chair, still symbolic, still lingering, started appearing in headlines as a metaphor for America's uncertain role in multilateral spaces. And although the transcript never mentions broader reactions from other G20 nations, the tension in the room told its own story. Uncertainty spreads, and diplomatic confusion can be as destabilizing as open conflict. By the time the room began to settle, one thing had become clear: this was more than a disagreement over attendance. It was a moment that exposed how fragile global communication can become when nations approach each other not with caution and respect, but with impatience and suspicion. And for millions watching around the world, especially those who grew up in an era of steadier international norms, it was unsettling to witness such a sharp rupture take place in full public view. From the American perspective, the message delivered at the end of the exchange was unmistakably firm. The representative made it clear that Washington did not appreciate how the South African president had characterized the U.S. role at the G20. To the Trump administration, the distinction mattered. They were not re-entering official talks, not returning to the negotiating table, and not reversing their previous withdrawal. Instead, they were sending a representative only to acknowledge the ceremonial handover, nothing more. For many Americans, especially those who have followed decades of summits and international conferences, this approach may feel familiar. The Trump administration often preferred sharp clarity over polite ambiguity. In their view, strong language communicated strength, and correcting public narratives quickly prevented misunderstandings from spreading. So, when the representative insisted that South Africa had falsely claimed U.S. participation in official talks, it reflected a style that favors direct confrontation over quiet correction behind closed doors. But what was clear from the tone, sharp, almost chastising, was that the United States wanted full control over its own narrative. They would not allow another head of state, especially one hosting a major summit, to define America's stance. Not even for a moment. For an older American audience, this may bring back echoes of past debates about diplomatic tone. Should the U.S. project power through restraint or through assertive, sometimes abrasive clarity? Outside the United States, however, the reaction looked very different. The world is accustomed to disagreements between nations, but not often in this tone and not often in public. Many international observers saw the clash as another sign that America's diplomatic posture had changed. Where previous administrations tended to lean on predictable structured communication, this moment reinforced a perception of unpredictability. The language used running his mouth was so blunt that diplomats around the world quietly questioned whether it signaled a deeper shift in how Washington intended to engage its partners. For smaller and emerging nations, especially across Africa and the global South, the moment carried another implication, a reminder of how fragile relationships with major powers can be. Here was a host nation, South Africa, trying to honor its responsibilities at the G20 only to be contradicted almost instantly by Washington. Many leaders watching from afar would have understood the message: when a superpower changes course, suddenly the burden falls entirely on the host, not on the visitor. European observers, though not present in this transcript, were inevitably drawn into the comparison. After all, the journalist's initial question had asked whether the EU had become a more predictable, reliable partner than the United States. The events that followed, confusion, contradiction, and a public scolding, only deepened that question. Even if the EU was not directly involved, the contrast between diplomatic styles was hard to ignore. And even though the transcript does not mention reactions from Asia, Latin America, or the BRICS nations, the tension in the room told its own story. When a nation as influential as the United States expresses itself sharply, the ripple effect travels far. It shapes how others negotiate, how they prepare, and how they interpret future statements. Words spoken in one hall can affect trust across continents. In the end, the clash was more than a disagreement about logistics. It became a moment when the world paused and reconsidered how America saw itself and how it expected others to receive its messages. It was a reminder that global leadership rests not only on power, but also on tone consistency and the way a nation handles uncertainty in front of the world. As the final words of the American representative faded, the summit hall returned to a tense quiet, one shaped not by expectation this time, but by reflection. The empty U.S. chair at the G20 table, the confusion surrounding last-minute notices, and the sharp public rebuke had all exposed something deeper than a diplomatic misunderstanding. They revealed a moment when the world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Global leadership depends as much on tone consistency and trust as it does on power. For older viewers, those who lived through decades when American engagement set the rhythm of multilateral meetings, witnessing this shift can feel unsettling. It raises questions that go beyond South Africa, beyond the G20, and beyond the personalities involved. If the United States can appear uncertain about its role on the world stage, even for a moment, what does that mean for the international system built over the past 70 years? What does it mean for allies who depend on clarity and for emerging nations seeking fairness and stability? The clash at this summit also serves as a quiet warning. Miscommunication between powerful nations rarely stays confined to one room. It ripples outward into financial markets, diplomatic calculations, and the perceptions of millions. When partners accuse each other publicly, trust does not just weaken, it fractures. And once fractured, it is far more difficult to rebuild. That is why even a single mistimed message, a single unclear statement, or a single harsh phrase can alter how nations relate to one another long after the cameras stop recording. But the larger story does not end in that summit hall. Around the world, other regions are watching, learning, and adjusting their expectations. Africa, in particular, has become more attentive to how major powers talk to one another and to them. Countries like Burkina Faso, under leaders such as Ibrahim Traore, have been openly redefining what partnerships should look like: predictable, respectful, and rooted in sovereignty. In moments like this, when established powers appear divided or unpredictable, nations seeking new models of cooperation take note. They look for steadiness wherever it can be found. So perhaps the most important question now is this: what kind of leadership does the world truly trust today, and what kind does it want for tomorrow? Should leadership be loud and forceful? Should it be steady and predictable? Or should it be something new entirely? Something built on the voices and experiences of nations that were once overlooked. If you've been watching global affairs for a long time, you know these questions don't disappear. They return again and again, reshaping alliances and expectations. And they will shape how America, Africa, and the world move forward long after this summit is remembered only in archives and headlines. If this story helped you see the bigger picture behind the headlines, please share it. If you believe the world needs clearer leadership and clearer truth, consider subscribing. And if you're among the first who want to understand Africa news, the rise of Burkina Faso, and the new leadership style represented by President Ibrahim Traore, your voice here matters more than ever.